Hello, everyone. My name is Fredrik Erixon. I'm one of the directors at the European Centre for International Political Economy, and I am recording this from South Korea, where I am right now in order to participate in the World Knowledge Forum, a big three-day conference, extraordinarily intensive, looking at the broad policies and modes of innovation in the global economy. I'm recording this because I've been spending the evening winding down the day reading Mario Draghi's new report on European competitiveness, and I think it's a very important event for the new European Commission and for the new European Parliament. I think there is an extraordinary amount of insights and wisdom in Mario Draghi's report, and I wanted to record a video in order to share a couple of points that I made while reading the report. The first one is to, of course, congratulate Draghi on this achievement. I know there are many of us that have been waiting for this report for quite some time, and it became sort of a long waiting game trying to figure out when he was actually going to release the report. But I think we can see in the report that the wait has been worthwhile. There are lots of good insights, lots of good recommendations that come in there. The first thing that occurred to me when I was reading it is to reflect a bit on the core points that he's making and why we haven't had a political process in the EU which have been recognizing them to the extent necessary over the past perhaps even 10 years. Draghi makes it abundantly clear that Europe has been falling behind in any type of measure that we want to choose when we compare to other OECD economies of size, like for instance the United States. GDP per capita has been growing far slower in EU over a long period of time than it has in America. Productivity growth has been far slower as well. And of course, that doesn't change much from year to year, or it doesn't add up to a big difference if we just look at development in productivity over a couple of years. But when you start to aggregate this up over decades and you look at patterns and trends that emerge over a long period of time, you see that these differences in productivity adds up to substantial difference in prosperity and, of course, capacity to shape outcomes in your economy after a while. I think another thing which occurred to me when I was reading is that the observation is that there is a lot of awfully bad regulation around in Europe. Draghi goes through many different sectors, look at different horizontal regulations and conclude that there are many mistakes that have been done over the last couple of years. We see that there is over-regulation, but also that there is conflicting regulation, that there are regulations that are so complex that no one really understands what they're all about. And then, of course, we can also sort of see what is the obvious thing, which is that these issues haven't really been front and center when the EU has made regulatory policies for a long period of time now. I think there are a lot of us that have been around for the past 15 years that have been trying to point time and again to different economic consequences that will arise because of bad regulation. But in many of these cases, these arguments, these points of evidence that we've been trying to amass haven't really had much of an influence at all. The EU has gone forward with lots of regulations that have been handicapping our own economy. A third thing which I think comes out very strongly as well, and it's not a new thing. I mean, we've pointed to it in several papers that we've done. There are lots of other think tanks and researchers that have pointed to the same thing, but it's important nevertheless, which is that Europe has been getting technology quite wrong over the last couple of decades. We've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to reduce the speed of technological change, how to avoid new technologies emerging in sectors where Europe perhaps hasn't been very strong. We've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out how existing companies, regardless of which sector they actually operate in, are going to be connected to the major stream of new technological change, without understanding that many of these processes, if you want to get technology right, basically means that we need to have a lot more market contestability, that we can't start the analysis or start the policy process with the view of trying to get the current top performers in Europe to remain top performers in Europe on the corporate side. We need to have a lot more market contestability, new entrepreneurs that come up and challenge the incumbents and use that entrepreneurial process in order to get technological change. And I think this leads to my conclusion, and I think which is the conclusion from Draghi as well, that there has been a long holiday from economic reality in the EU. Until 2014, 2015, we of course spent a lot of time thinking about fiscal monetary policies and the problems that emerged in the Eurozone and problems that had emerged elsewhere as well. Before that, during the financial crises, but many of these underlying dynamics, they have been disregarded for a long time, and we need to now have a strong overcorrection in how we make policies in Europe. So what is important now then? Well, there are 5 things that I think comes out in Draghi's report which I believe are important. I mean, they are really important. Then there are a lot of other things that come in the report as well that I don't think are equally important. The first thing is to find a way to liberate capital markets in Europe. That's the number one policy. When we look at the volumes of corporate investments, when we look at what type of investments we have in Europe, we can see that there are huge gaps to the performance, not just in the United States, but in other OECD countries as well. And this is not a problem that comes from insufficient savings or insufficient capital in Europe. It's something which comes from the fact that we have regulations that constrain these savings from being channeled into the economy, that we haven't had a rich variety in capital markets of the kind that they've had elsewhere. And I think this has led to a gradual erosion of the way that we can capitalize firm, close new investments, but it's also led to, of course, an emigration of many good business ideas to other parts of the world. So number one, liberate capital markets. Number two is to cut regulation and cut red tape. I think it's bleeding obvious from this report as well as from many other reports that Europe has decided to go ahead with a policy that simply don't stand up to reality. We can't regulate all sectors or specific sectors deeper, harder, faster than any other comparable economies and think that this is not going to have disadvantages for European companies. That is going to reduce investment, reduce experimentation, and reduce the opportunities for small and medium-sized companies to grow up and start to compete for real in the economy. We need, as a second point, to cut regulation and also go ahead with regulations that make business life more predictable, avoid these overly complex type of regulations which requires PhD degrees in legalese in order to understand what they actually mean. Third, we need to incentivize R&D. Again, a very, very strong point from the Draghi report, and he looks at gaps in EU R&D spending, and of course points to, which is something which has been clear coming out from our analysis as well, which is that the problem in Europe is not necessarily that governments spend too little on R&D. I think we can make a very strong case for government to spend even more on R&D in what they're doing, but that's not where we find Europe sliding behind other comparable economies. It's the corporate R&D part which is the most problematic one. And that one we can only try to improve by providing much stronger incentives for companies to allocate more resources to R&D, tax incentives, but also human capital incentives. And I'm going to come to that in my fourth point, which is something which is pretty obvious to anyone who follows the European business sector, which is that there is a strong skills gap and a strong human capital gap. That we both need more skills, but that we also need much more advanced skills, that we need to have a serious upgrade in human capital and make sure that we provide the economy with the human capital it actually needs in order to compete. If we look, for instance, at computer engineers, AI engineers, we have net migration of these type of human capital from the EU. We spend a lot of money and a lot of time educating them. We have universities that provide good education and that are, by international standards, pretty good in terms of generating highly educated STEM R&D and sort of R&D oriented and more focused human capital. But a larger portion of them emigrate to other parts of the world where there is much greater job opportunities, and of course where the reward on that human capital is also greater. And the fifth point, which is not really strongly coming out in Draghi's report, but he alludes to it, which is the importance of keeping our borders open for trade and other forms of cross-border exchange. Draghi makes a big song and dance about economic security and the need to reduce vulnerabilities, and as a general headline thing, I think that's pretty okay and a pretty sort of decent orientation of what we need to do. But the big message, of course, is that the lion's share of all new growth in the world economy happens outside the EU. And if we want to have the opportunity to prosper on the back of all that new demand, all that new technology and ideas that are being generated outside our borders, we need to keep our own trade borders open and avoid that slide into protectionism, and especially sort of a regulatory style protectionism that the EU has favored over the last 10 years. We need to get these 5 things right, and basically if we don't get these 5 things right, very few of the other things that Draghi proposes or that other proposers are going to have much of an impact on the economy. It's not going to shape outcomes very much, so we really need to get these 5 points right. I started out by saying I'm recording this from South Korea, and there was a purpose to why I also said this, because I'm quite impressed by South Korea as an economy and what it has done. If we look at the broad regulatory development and we compare South Korea to many of the other leading economies in the world, South Korea started out being a much higher and much more regulated economy than, say, Germany or United States in the past. But through diligent hard work over a long period of time, freedoms in order to do business has increased a lot in this country, and that has also affected a broader change on the innovation ecology and the rise of many new different companies that have grown up and also starting to compete with some of the old incumbent companies in South Korea. But then we have R&D, and R&D is perhaps the most important point. Draghi rightly identifies that if the EU is going to live up to its Lisbon strategy target of having 3% of GDP being allocated to R&D every year, we need to increase that with about 125 billion euros per year. That's a very significant change in R&D spending. But then again, you can ask yourself, why 3%? I mean, 3% was a target that was decided a long time ago, reflecting an economy which isn't around us anymore. The modern economy is far more sophisticated and R&D driven than what the economy looked like when that 3% target was decided. So if we want to go, for instance, to where United States is in R&D, we need to go to 3.5%. And that basically means that we have 200 billion euros missing a year in order to reach that type of level of spending. That's not going to be achievable by having sort of a automatic spending where an equal share is going to be taken by all countries. There's no point chasing, for instance, Bulgaria or Romania for not spending amounts in R&D of that level. It's much more important to focus on the companies that are highly sophisticated and have the capacity to increase spending more. So countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, I'm looking at you because it's basically there we need to see the big efforts being made in order to increase R&D spending. These economies already spend much more than the EU average, and I know some of them are being proud that they spend 3.1% of GDP on R&D every year. But that's not going to be enough if they are going to be the frontier economies that are going to help to raise overall spending in the EU. That spending needs to go up much more than that. If we look, for instance, at South Korea, they have a spending which is close to 5% of GDP on R&D every year. And that's probably the benchmark for many of these countries that I mentioned, that it's not okay for these advanced economies to think that they are doing their job just because they're spending 3.1 or 3.3% of GDP on R&D every year. They need to go up closer to 5%, and they need to go that soon. And I think this example of South Korea and what you can achieve when you start to combine much more R&D input into the economy with that freedom to experiment, freedom to innovate, then you're also going to find that the economy is going to perform a lot better than it used to do in the past. So thank you for listening in, and thank you also to Mario Draghi, if he is watching this, for what I think is a very, very good report. I have a couple of critical points that I'm going to share in the future as well, but I wanted to say these first. So thank you.